Hi everyone, it's me, Krylios, Team Racing Productions MC and producer. And welcome to Team Racing YouTube, Mecca Jamilah Sullivan. Welcome.
Hello, thank you so much. How's it going?
Hello, it is great to have you here. It is great to have you here. How are you?
Doing well. I'm excited to be here for sure.
I think, have I lost her?
I'm here.
Okay, great. Here we are. We're back.
Yeah,
We're back.
here we
Okay,
go.
awesome. Let's me start this off once again because I feel like we had a little bit. I just want you to introduce yourself to everyone and give us a little bit about your background.
Okay, will do. So I am Mecca Jamilah Sullivan. I'm a writer, a teacher, a scholar. My training is in English literature. So I have a Ph.D. in English literature. I'm a professor, associate professor of English at Georgetown, but I'm also a creative writer and I love writing about Black people, queer people, feminist experience, and my research and my writing kind of all center in those areas: Black queer feminist research, Black queer feminist artistic expression, and the like.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, it is certainly a pleasure to have you here. So let's talk about your writing a little bit because you talk about the perspective that you come from with your writing. Tell me how the Black queer feminist perspective became a thing that you really wanted to focus on, and how that has helped you develop your writing for being a writer.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, I always say like my kind of, enthusiasm and passion for Black feminist literature happened at the same time as I learned about Black feminism as a thing, and at the same time as I learned about writing as a thing that I could do. So basically, I was, a little girl, and I'm sure, you talk with a lot of artists, probably a lot of us, right? It starts when we're young,
Mhm. Yes, yes.
And so for me, there's no exception. I was about 11 or so, and kind of in my mom's library reading books I probably had no business reading, but I started reading Ntozake Shange's For Colored Girls Who Have Considered Suicide When the Rainbow Is
Mhm.
Enough, Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye. And again, I wasn't old enough to fully understand any of those texts, but something spoke to me, and I think really what spoke to me was just the knowledge that like talking about young Black girls' experience and Black women's experience, that could be something that you could do for a career, that's a way
Yes,
that you could spend your
yes.
time, that people would want to read it. So I was just like open from that point on, honestly. And for me, my perspective was always a kind of queer perspective. Of course, I didn't have that language for it then, but
Mhm.
realizing that the parts that interested me most were kind of women understanding their relationships with their body in ways that weren't quite accepted as the norm, or their relationships with each other, right? The kind of the
Yes.
social relationships that kids have where they're not really thinking about whose gender is what or whose,
Mhm.
anatomy is
Mhm.
what. That was always really interesting to me. So fast forward, several years, I decided this is what I want to do with my life. I want to study Black queer and feminist literature, and I want to create it myself.
Awesome. Talk to me about some of those Black queer feminist queer women books and literature that have really inspired you.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, it's probably no surprise. Audrey Lord, right, is like,
Of
it and
course.
everything. Yeah. And I mean, my first encounters, I'm from Harlem, New York, where she lived for, most of her growing
Mm.
up. I actually grew up on the same block that she grew up on many, many years later. Yeah. So like there's a kind of personal love there as well for me, you know what I mean? And a deep connection. My mother actually put me on to Audrey Lorde when I was a kid also. She took
Yeah.
me to her memorial when she passed away. So that's always been a very deeply personal connection, as well as, I've had the chance to write about her work. I got a chance to write the introduction to the volume of her letters, her and another dope, incredible Black
Ah,
lesbian poet, Pat Parker, right? They were kind of
yeah.
like friends, and they had a kind of mutual mentoring relationship. And so Julie Enser, who's a great editor and poet in and of herself, she collected like a volume of their letters, and I got to write an introduction to that volume, which was a fantastic, just one of those like life-changing
Yes, I'm
writing
sure.
experiences. So Audrey for sure is kind of, at the top for me. Akilah Oliver is a really fantastic Black lesbian poet. Dion Brand, a Black lesbian poet and novelist who's Trinidadian, Trinbagonian rather, Canadian.
Okay.
And then also, in my most recent book, which is called The Poetics of Difference, Queer Feminist Forms in the African Diaspora, I take a kind of broad perspective, not only on what queerness means, but also what literature means. And so there I'm talking not only about Lord and, about Akila Oliver, and I talk about, Dion Brand, but I also talk about hip hop, for example. I talk about Krylios, which is a really fantastic queer Cuban hip hop group. And I'm kind of thinking about how they are writers as well, right? And how hip hop is a literary form, I also look at kind of queerness in different sort of different ways that queerness might be read, right? So the queerness maybe is not only about what our sexual practice is or who we might sleep with or who we might be attracted to, but it's also about a kind of political stance, right? Where we're sort of using the norm. And so from that perspective, I'm reading, certain Toni Morrison texts as like texts that are available for a kind of queer reading, queer analysis. Missy Elliott, is somebody who, as a hip hop artist, she's a dope writer and she really kind of queers language, queers in her conversations about sex and sexuality, desire. So, for me, all of that is kind of the most expansive and therefore the most accurate way to think about both queerness and literature.
Awesome. Amazing. And of course, I'm a huge fan of literature. It was my favorite subject in all schools, and it was creative writing was my minor at Howard. So I want to talk to you about what writing and just the written word means for you, telling a story, creating a narrative, what it means for you personally, and its place in society, the history of mankind.
Yeah, I love that question. Well, I mean, I think, we live in a Western culture that sort of privileges written stories over others, right? So that, if you want your story to exist, you need to write it down. And of course, in recent decades, right, people have been kind of thinking, okay, wait, maybe that's not everything. Maybe we need to pay attention to oral storytelling, right? Like think about oral cultures. This is another way to access histories. But I think it's still fair to say that generally speaking, the print record is the one that ends up being, it's the one that ends up defining history, right? So I think for me and many, many other writers and academics, right, part of it is about just making sure our stories are told and making sure they last, right? Making sure they endure so that nobody can say you didn't tell them. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And so for me, that's part of what drives me to write. Yeah. But, as you said too, it's interesting because the other part of it is like, even when we, especially as Black queer people, I'll speak for myself as a Black queer woman, as a fat Black queer woman, right, cis woman, I'm very clear that, the languages that we have available to tell our stories don't quite get it, right? And I feel like, I could try to tell my story in a kind of very standard narrative using only, kind of quote unquote proper English, right? And telling it in a way that is very legible and, relatable or recognizable. But that's going to miss something. And so for me, it's also about kind of getting in there and messing with language a little bit, either inventing new languages or switching up the point of view a little bit, or, whatever you can do to kind of really make sure that the story is not only told, but also felt. And I think that's what real kind of strong Black queer feminist writing can do.
Oh God, that is beautiful. That's beautiful. I want to talk to about some of the creative writing you've done and talk about how you go about creating, certain characters and, the messages and stories and themes that you're trying to get across. So take me through some of those from some of the things you've written.
Yeah, I love that. So, it's interesting. My first book was a short story collection titled Blue Talk and Love. And, those stories, every time I talk about those stories, I always say they always started with voice, right? Like I would, it sounds a little bit out there, but a lot of writers talk about this, right? You kind of hear a voice, you kind of get a feel at least for a voice of a character. And you're like, okay, let me ride that voice and let me see where the voice takes me. And so that's kind of what most of my short stories, that's how they begin. And even if it's not like a first person story, right? Even if the character isn't telling the story, still the voice of the character is usually my first kind of invitation to the page. You know what I mean? Interestingly, my novel, Big Girl, which is coming out in July, It's a little bit different. That began with a story. I knew there was a story I wanted to tell. And it's the story of a young Black queer woman who, kind of struggles with people's perceptions of her body, specifically her weight, from the time she's 8 years old to the time she's a teenager, and kind of following how, her relationship with her body becomes a kind of like metaphor for all kinds of dominant, kind of colonial, racist, sexist
Yes.
narratives about race, about gender, about class, right? Even as she's just this girl trying to grow up.
Yeah.
And so that was a story that, I knew I wanted to tell. I had a certain sense of some of the plot points, and I kind of knew where the story needed to go, more or less.
And when did you start writing Big Girl,
Ooh,
or
that's a
even
good
thinking
question.
about it?
Well, I started thinking about it when I, was a big girl myself as a kid, right? I mean, this is definitely the book that I feel like it sounds like a stretch to say, but it's the book I feel like I was born to write.
Oh, the
And
Magnus Opus,
with the
maybe.
manual, exactly, exactly. And by that, I don't mean that it's the best book I'll ever write. I hope it's not. In fact, I hope to continue to get better. But it's the book that I feel like really kind of demonstrates what I want to say to the world at this point in my life. And I think it's
Yes.
something that needs to be said. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, I started conceptualizing and thinking about it way, way, way back in the day. Honestly, probably around that same time as I'm reading these other books. I'm reading Morrison, I'm reading Shange, and I'm like, ooh, wait, this could be a thing, you know what I mean? And I have a story to
Yes.
tell too. But when I started actually putting pen to paper, it was actually my master's thesis way back in the day. I'm not going to give you the exact year, long time ago. It was a very different book at that point. It was, it was a very different book. I started working on it as soon as I started my master's degree, in fact. And, was just kind of working on it. And then I had a full draft, but I knew I needed to do some more work on it. And I went and got a PhD, really thinking like, let me kind of like ground myself in literature. Let me learn as much as I can about literature to become the best writer I can be to write this novel. And, I didn't really know that, okay, getting a PhD isn't just something that you kind of do on the side while you're writing your novel, you know what I mean? So, while I was writing, I basically like, during breaks, right, between semesters, or anytime I could find a week or a weekend, I would put the dissertation on hold and go back and just be working on the novel and working on short stories, actually.
Yes.
And that was how I was able to come out with Blue Talking Love, was because I had these little short periods of time while I was doing a PhD to be like, okay, I can write I might not be able to finish the novel right now, but I can write a short story. That's how I got that out. And then, yeah, since then, it really has been just kind of like juggling these two different book projects, but making sure, I never, my commitment to the novel never waned. You know what I mean? Like, it
Yes.
always
Yes.
has
Yes.
been, deep, deep and present in my heart. And
Yes.
so I'm
Yes.
just happy to share it with the world, honestly.
Certainly. One of the things I'm picking up is how from you right now is how important it is to be true to your voice in your writing, how important it is to put that out there, whatever it is, even if it's not necessarily, what is already out there. As a matter of fact, better than if it's
Yeah.
anything that's already out there.
Yeah.
I remember when I was younger, because and I've always been conceptualizing, whatever I'm gonna write or whatever books. And I'm Jamaican, and many times in my stories, and the individual is Jamaican, I feel like I am forced to write their dialogue in a more standard English way, thinking of the audience and not necessarily the truth of the character. And it was Marlon James,
Yes.
when I started reading his books, and I was like, okay, he is doing the
Yep.
full Jamaican
That's
Creole.
right.
He's
Bring
giving
it
the whole
all.
thing.
Yes.
And when he won the Man Booker Prize, I was like, okay, well, this is what I really needed to see to kind of, make me not fear doing that and really being able to be true to one's voice. And that, I think, is so important in any type of queer, feminist, Black literature or writing in any way, shape, or form. How important really is that?
Yeah. Oh, 100%. I agree completely. I mean, as you're talking, I'm thinking, Yes, right. And like so many of us, we can point to the books that really speak to us, right, are the ones that we relate to in a way that is sort of beyond the dominant narrative, beyond the standard, beyond the norm, right? For a lot of people, Alice Walker's The Color Purple is another example of that. The
Yes.
entire book is written in what, some call dialect, right? African
Yep.
American vernacular, right? English.
With queer
And
characters.
very queer. Okay.
Yes.
Very queer. All right. Exactly. Exactly. And, that's the early 1980s, right? And Walker says, I'm going to put this book out in this way that is true to, as you said, to my own voice, true to my characters. And I think part of what I'm saying in the Poetics of Difference is that in and of itself is a political act, right? Because what you're saying is, you can give me the award or you cannot give me the award, right? What matters is the story I'm telling and how I'm telling it. And in fact, if you want to have access to this story, if you want to know these characters, if you want to understand what happens, you're going to have to possibly do some intellectual labor, right, to get into the story. In the same way that you and I, we know this experience quite well when we're reading certain forms of English that don't speak to us in those ways, right? It requires some intellectual labor of us. And I think Marlon James, Alice Walker, Audrey Lord, they're Missy again, this moment where Missy, I have a section in the book where I talk about the song Work It, right? Is it worth it? Let me work it, right? And then you hear this section of voice where you don't really know what she's saying, but you feel it, right? You like, whatever it is, you know what I mean? You feel it. And either you're in it enough that you understand it and you feel it and you're going to ride with it, or you do the work to figure out what is being said, right? And like that move is suggesting that your easy access to the text is not the most important thing, right? So it's really sort of centering the Black woman, the Black queer subject, the Black Jamaican subject, right? And saying like, this is the teller of the story. You can do the work and you'll benefit from doing the work to kind of get into the story with them.
Awesome. All right. So for what advice do you have for any young upcoming writer who, currently has stories in their heads or currently has pen to paper and, they're really trying to get it together to complete that story or those stories? What advice do you have for them?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, right. I think that's my advice is right. Keep writing. I think there's something to be said for the act of like getting the story from your head onto the page. That's where a lot of people get tripped up, right? I think everyone has a story to tell. Like Biggie said, everybody got a story to tell, right? But who writers are the people who decide to commit those stories to the record in whatever way. You know what I mean? And that doesn't mean you have to be someone who gets up every day at 5 a.m. and writes. Some people do that, and I admire those people. I'm not one of them. Maybe one day, But I think really kind of like valuing your work enough to commit to it, right? It's I'm gonna write this down. Again, whether I get published or not, whether they give me the award or not, whether, it's whoever reads it, whoever is able to recognize the value of it, I see the value of it. And I'm going to show up for my work in that way, right? Just as you would with a partner or your friends, you know what I mean? Really kind of like, have that bond and that commitment to your writing. I think that's my thing. And on a more practical note, I do think that once you have something that you feel proud of, I think it's a good idea to send it out. I found when I was working on the PhD and trying to still really kind of be a creative writer, that was what kept me going, was being like, well, if I'm publishing, the secret is out. I'm a creative writer, you know what I mean? And there's something about deadlines and accountability that I think can be really helpful when you start to, when your faith and confidence in your writing starts to waver, knowing that someone is expecting you to send them a story on a certain date, right? Or you have to get this book together for the deadline or whatever it is, that can help kind of like fill in when motivation isn't quite bringing everything it needs to.
Certainly. Well, thank you for that. Thank you for that. Now, how can people watching learn more about you, learn more about your writing, pick up your books, and when they'll find Big Girl coming out this July?
Yes, all the things. Okay, so follow me on all the things. Follow me on Instagram, on Twitter. I have a Facebook author page as well. I would welcome the chance to kind of kick it with folks there. My website, MeccaJamilahSullivan.com. So check that out. This gives you the discount code for the Poetics of Difference, and I believe that it's a 30% discount. So I hope that folks will check that out. And yeah, Big Girl drops July 12th, so I'm really excited. I'll be doing readings in the DC area around that time, and all really nationwide. So you follow me on the socials, and you'll see what's going on with that. The kind of next thing I have going on is I'm actually a New York City LGBTQ Writers in the Schools author, which is something I'm super excited about. Yeah, it's not public, but I wanted to share it because it's such a dope program that I feel like people don't know much about. I didn't know much about it, but basically I get to kind of like talk with high school and junior high school students about, queerness and about my writing. On a few different schools. In fact, in New York City, it's through Lambda Literary. So that's an exciting program that I'm looking forward to being part of. Yeah.
Awesome.
And I'm here in DC, so invite me. I'm ready to be in these streets and meet people.
Yes. I will take you up on that offer. Certainly. I will take you up on that offer. Well, thank you so much for being here with me today. It has been such a pleasure. Thank you for what you're doing in writing. Thanks for what you're doing for the community. And just thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much. Right back at you. I appreciate it. And I can't wait to read more of your work as well.
Certainly. Thank you so much. And so to our viewers, please follow Team Racing Productions on all forms of social media. But most of all, thank you for watching. Bye, everyone.
Bye.